at 5:47 a.m. Nurse Mara Stanton pressed her back against the cold cinder block wall of Harlow General's emergency bay and counted 6 armed men she had never seen before. They wore tactical gear, black vests, earpieces, boots with lateral reinforcement, but their insignia was wrong. The patches on their shoulders were off by 1 thread color, the radio frequencies they used were obsolete, and the way their point man swept the corridor told her everything she needed to know. These were not hospital security. These were not law enforcement. And when their commander looked at her and said, "Step aside, sweetheart," Mara said nothing. She just looked at the patch on his chest and whispered, almost to herself, "You have no idea who you're standing in front of." If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, subscribe so you don't miss a single part, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started like every other Tuesday. Mara Stanton arrived at Harlow General Medical Center at 5:15, 45 minutes before the start of her shift in the trauma unit, because she had always been early. Not because anyone asked her to be. Not because she was trying to impress anyone. She was early because the trauma bay at 5:15 was quiet, in a way it would never be again once the day got moving, and she used that quiet to check equipment, restock drawers, and think through whatever cases had come in overnight. She had worked at Harlow General for 3 years. Before that, she had worked somewhere else entirely. But she didn't talk about that, and nobody here had ever asked the right questions to find out. The hospital sat on the eastern edge of Briar Falls, a mid-sized city in a part of the country. Country people drove through more than they drove to. The kind of place with a good college, a struggling downtown, and a medical center that served 4 counties because it was the only one big enough to matter. Harlow General was not glamorous. It was underfunded, understaffed, and held together by people who cared more than their paychecks suggested they should. Mara fit in there, or at least she told herself she did. She changed into her scrubs in the locker room, poured coffee from the nurse's station pot that was always slightly burnt, and walked the length of the trauma corridor doing her usual check. Bay 1, empty. Bay 2, post-op observation, a 63-year-old with a fractured pelvis from a car accident 2 days prior. Bay 3, empty. Bay 4, a teenage boy who'd come in around 2 in the morning with a laceration from a construction site accident, currently sleeping, vitals steady. She was on her way back from Bay 4 when she heard the exterior doors open. Not the front entrance, not the ambulance bay. The emergency service entrance at the far end of the corridor, a set of reinforced steel doors that required a key card and a specific security code to open from outside. A code that changed weekly and was issued only to authorized personnel. Those doors opened. Mara stopped. 6 men came through in a staggered formation, 2 in front, 1 scanning left, 1 scanning right, 2 more close behind. Black tactical vests. Gloves. Boots that didn't squeak on the linoleum the way standard-issue hospital security boots did. They carried radios clipped at the shoulder and moved in a way that most people would have read as professional, maybe even impressive. Mara read it differently. She watched the point man, the one in front, shorter than the others, with close-cropped gray hair and a jaw like a shovel blade, sweep his eyes across the corridor in a pattern that was almost correct. Almost. But he cleared the corner before checking the ceiling line, which you never did, and his pivot on the left was a half-beat late, which told her he'd trained in a controlled environment and never actually worked a dynamic entry in a space with unpredictable obstacles. She clocked the patches on their shoulders. The design was right, the general shape of a federal contractor emblem she recognized from memory, but the thread color on the outer ring was gold instead of the dark amber it was supposed to be, and the font on the unit designation was sans serif when it should have been block serif. Somebody had made these patches from a photograph. Not a very good photograph. The commander, she assumed he was the commander because he was the one not moving, standing at the center of the formation with his weight slightly back, watching the others work, turned and found her standing there with her coffee. "Facilities being placed under a security protocol," he said. "Staff are asked to remain in their designated areas until further notice." "Under whose authority?" Mara asked. "Harlow General Administration and coordinating federal contractors." He said it the way people say things when they've rehearsed them. Smooth delivery, no hesitation, no warmth. "You'll receive a briefing through your supervisor." "Which federal agency?" He looked at her for a moment. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your station." "I heard you," she said. "I asked which federal agency." The man to his left, younger, bigger, the kind of big that came from a gym rather than a job, took a half step forward. Not aggressive, just present. The way you step forward when you want someone to feel outnumbered. Mara looked at him, then looked back at the commander. "Your patches are wrong," she said. Nobody moved. "The thread color on the outer ring, and your unit font, both wrong." She kept her voice level. Whoever made those didn't have access to the actual specs. The commander's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A recalibration. He looked at her the way people look at something they've suddenly realized they misjudged. "Step aside," he said. "Now." She didn't move. Not yet. Because she was still counting. 6 men visible. The doors behind them had taken 7 seconds to close fully after they entered, which meant either a 7th man was holding the exterior or the locking mechanism had been bypassed manually. And if it had been bypassed manually, then someone inside the building had helped them. "Sweetheart," he said, lower now, quieter. And that was when she said it. "You have no idea who you're standing in front of." She said it almost to herself, not as a threat. More like a statement of fact she was making to the air, or maybe to whatever version of her past she'd tried to leave behind in a place she didn't think about anymore. Then she stepped aside, because 6 armed men in a hospital corridor was not the right moment to push, and walked to the nurse's station to find a phone. The call she made went to the charge nurse supervisor, a woman named Deborah Finch, who had been running the trauma unit for 11 years, and had the patience of someone who had seen everything. Mara told her what she'd seen, described the entry formation, the patches, the code access, the commander's demeanor, and the fact that none of them had produced identification when asked. Deborah listened. Then she said, "Dr. Hargrove authorized a new security contractor last week. There was a memo." "Did the memo specify federal contractors?" "It mentioned a coordinating arrangement, enhanced security protocol." Deborah's voice had the slightly flattened quality of someone reading off a piece of paper they're not fully sure they understand. "It said there might be personnel arriving this week." "Did the memo specify which federal agency?" A pause. "It didn't, actually." "And the emergency service entrance code, has it been shared outside of standard authorization?" Another pause. Longer. "I'll need to look into that," Deborah said. "I think we should call administration," Mara said. What she didn't say was, "I think we should call someone else first," because she didn't have enough yet. She had wrong patches and a bad sweep pattern and a door that opened too easily, and that was enough to make her certain something was wrong, but not enough to explain to anyone why she was certain. Not without explaining things about herself she had spent 3 years not explaining. She hung up and went back to the trauma corridor. The 6 men had spread out. 2 were stationed near the entrance to the ICU access corridor. 2 more were near the stairwell. The commander was speaking quietly into his radio near the nursing alcove, and the big man who'd stepped forward earlier was standing in the center of the hall, watching the corridor with the careful stillness of someone who'd been trained to do it but hadn't had to do it in a while. The teenage boy in Bay 4 was awake. Mara could see him through the bay window, sitting up slightly, watching the men in the hall with the particular expression teenagers get when they're trying to decide if something is cool or actually wrong. She went in and adjusted his IV line, which didn't need adjusting because she needed a reason to be in the room. "Those guys security?" he asked. "Working on finding out," she said. "They look kind of intense for a hospital." "They do," she agreed. "The big one keeps checking the door to that back hallway like something's in there." Mara glanced at the bay window. The big man was, in fact, positioned so that his sightline covered the secondary access corridor that ran behind the trauma unit, a corridor that connected to the hospital's utility infrastructure, and more importantly, to the backup generator room and the medical records server access point. That was not a position you took if you were securing a hospital. That was a position you took if you were protecting something specific inside it. She finished with the IV line, told the boy to get some rest, and walked back out into the corridor. Dr. Aldrich Hargrove arrived at 7:15, which was when the administrative wing opened and when the department chief was expected on rounds. He was a tall man in his mid-50s with silver hair worn slightly long and the kind of deliberate posture that people develop when they've spent enough years being the authority in the room. He had been chief administrator of Harlow General for 6 years, and operated the hospital with a level of control that the board had once described as rigorous, and the nursing staff privately described as exhausting. Mara intercepted him in the main corridor before he reached the trauma wing. "Dr. Hargrove," she said, "I need to speak with you about the security personnel in the trauma unit." He slowed, looked at her. "Nurse Stanton, Mara Stanton, trauma unit, night to morning shift." "Right." He resumed walking. "The enhanced security protocol has been communicated to department heads. There's no cause for concern." She fell into step beside him. The men in the trauma corridor entered through the emergency service entrance using the weekly security code, which means either the code was shared outside standard authorization or someone inside provided access. "The protocol arrangement, their federal contractor patches are fabricated," she said. He stopped walking. "The thread color on the outer ring is wrong, and the unit designation font doesn't match the standard. Someone made those patches from an image source, not the actual specifications." Dr. Hargrove turned to look at her fully for the first time. His expression moved through several things in quick succession: surprise, reassessment, a flicker of something that might have been genuine concern, before settling on something harder and more deliberate. "You're a nurse," he said. "Yes." "How would you know what federal contractor patches are supposed to look like?" "I know," she said. "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed. "It's not. But I'm right. And I think you should verify it before you let those men continue operating in the trauma wing." He studied her for a long moment. She held his gaze and let him look. "I appreciate your diligence," he said finally. "I'll look into it. In the meantime, I'd ask you to let the security team do their work without interference. And if I see something that concerns me medically, then you bring it to your supervisor, same as always." He turned away. "Thank you, Nurse Stanton." He walked toward the administrative corridor. He did not look back. Mara stood in the hallway and watched him go and thought, he knows something. Not what she knew, not about the patches, but something about those men being in the building, something he'd agreed to, something he'd let happen, something that was already locked inside him with all the security of a man who had made a decision and decided not to revisit it. She didn't know what it was yet, but she knew the shape of it. By 8 o'clock, the security team had extended their presence to the second floor. Two of the men had moved to the medical records corridor, which connected to the server room where patient records, financial data, and billing systems were housed. This was significant. A security team legitimately tasked with protecting a hospital would have no operational reason to position personnel near the records infrastructure unless they were specifically protecting it or accessing it. Mara worked her shift. She drew blood, changed dressings, administered medications, updated charts. She did every piece of her job with the precise, unhurried focus of someone who had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do in a tense situation was move like you were rattled. But she was watching. She watched the rotation pattern. Every 40 minutes, like clockwork, the two men near the records corridor switched with one of the men near the ICU access. The timing was too consistent for a reactive security detail. It was a scheduled rotation, which meant they'd planned this in advance, and they had enough people to sustain it, which meant this was bigger than 6 men. She watched the commander. He spent most of the morning on his radio, speaking in short bursts with pauses between that suggested he was receiving information, processing it, responding. He was running something, or coordinating with someone who was running something, and the hospital was the location, not the target. Something was happening here, or was about to. At 8:40, Deborah Finch found her in the medication room. "Administration wants you to take your lunch break early," Deborah said. "It's 8:40. "I know. Dr. Hargrove's office called. They're asking staff who aren't actively on patient care to clear the trauma corridor for the time being." Mara looked at her. "He's sidelining me." Deborah had the expression of a woman who didn't want to confirm what she clearly believed was true. "He's managing the situation by moving me out of the unit." "Mara," Deborah lowered her voice, "I've known Hargrove for 11 years. He doesn't like being challenged, especially not in front of... Did you look into the access code?" A beat. The code was shared with the security contractor as part of the protocol arrangement. By who? Administration. Which administrator? Deborah didn't answer. Deborah. Which administrator authorized sharing the emergency service entrance code with an external contractor? Dr. Hargrove authorized it personally, Deborah said, quietly, like it tasted bad. It was signed off 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. Before anything had happened. Before any visible reason for a security protocol had existed, which meant whatever was happening inside this hospital, Dr. Aldrich Hargrove had seen it coming. Well, she took the break she was told to take, not because she'd given up, but because she needed to think without being observed. And the trauma corridor was no longer a place she could do that without someone reporting back to Hargrove. She sat in the small break room at the end of the staff corridor with her coffee and her phone and worked through what she knew. 6 men, at minimum, operating under fabricated federal credentials. Emergency service entrance access authorized 2 weeks in advance by the chief administrator. Personnel positioned near medical records infrastructure. A rotation schedule that suggested pre-planning and off-site coordination. And a chief administrator who had told her, clearly and without much subtlety, to stop looking. She pulled up the Harlow General public directory on her phone and cross-referenced it with the contractor information she'd seen on the intake sheet the security team had filed at the front desk. She'd read it upside down when she walked past, which was a habit she'd stopped apologizing for, and found the company name, Garrison Tactical Solutions, LLC. She searched for it. The website was clean, professional, recent, too recent. Domain registered 14 months ago. No physical address listed, only a contact form, no leadership names, no client roster. The certifications listed were real organizations, but the certificate numbers, 2 of which she cross-referenced in available federal contractor databases, returned no results. Garrison Tactical Solutions did not exist in any verifiable way. She sat with that for a moment. Then her pager went off. Trauma activation. All available trauma staff to the trauma bay, stat. Multiple incoming casualties, motor vehicle accident on Route 9, ETA 6 minutes. She was already moving before the page finished. The accident had involved a delivery truck and 2 passenger vehicles on the county highway. 4 patients incoming, 2 critical, 1 serious, 1 moderate. The trauma team assembled in the bay, Dr. Yolanda Ferris, the attending, 2 trauma nurses, a respiratory tech, and Mara, who slipped back into the unit in the controlled chaos of activation and took her position without anyone having time to tell her to leave. The first ambulance arrived at 9:17. The patient was a man in his 40s, unresponsive, significant chest trauma, BP dropping. Ferris called the room into action, and they moved, efficiently, without wasted motion, everyone knowing their role. Mara worked the left line, drew blood, called out the pressure readings as Ferris directed, and kept her eyes and hands in exactly the right places. The second patient arrived 4 minutes later, more stable but with a head injury that complicated the picture. Bay 2 filled. The unit was running at capacity. The fake security team was still in the corridor, and then their commander made his first serious mistake. He stepped into the trauma bay doorway during an active resuscitation and told Dr. Ferris that the trauma bay was being restricted to essential personnel only and that non-clinical staff needed to vacate the area. Ferris was a 47-year-old trauma surgeon who had trained at a Level 1 center in a city that did not forgive mistakes, and she did not look up from her patient when she said, "Get out of my trauma bay." "Ma'am, I have authorization. I don't care what you have." She was placing a chest tube and her voice was absolutely flat. "You are in an active resuscitation, and if you take one more step into this room, I will have you removed by hospital security. The real kind." The commander stayed in the doorway. Mara, from her position at the head of the bay, watched him. He was looking at something, not the patient, not Ferris. He was looking at the wall panel, the one that housed the emergency communication system, the one that connected to the hospital-wide PA and to the external notification network. He was looking at it with the focused attention of someone who wanted to know if it was active. Why would he care if the emergency communication system was active? Unless he didn't want someone outside the hospital knowing what was happening inside it. The pressure reading on Mara's patient dropped. "Pressure's off," she said. 60 over palp. Ferris shifted her attention back. "Push the blood. Get the OR on the phone." And for the next 11 minutes, everything else had to wait, because the man on the table in front of her was dying, and she was the one keeping him from getting there faster. But she kept one piece of her attention in the doorway. And the commander stayed. And the way he stood there, watching that wall panel, watching the team, watching the room, felt less like security and more like a man waiting for something to start. She just didn't know what yet. The patient stabilized. Barely, and not without a fight, but he stabilized. And when Mara finally had a moment to look up, the commander was gone from the doorway. But the big man, the one who'd stepped forward at her in the corridor that morning, was now standing at the end of the hall outside the trauma bay, and he was holding a tablet, and he was looking at something on the screen with the focused intensity of a man reading a document he wasn't supposed to have. And on the corner of the tablet screen, visible from where she stood because she had always had good eyes, was the Harlow General logo. I was inside their system. She didn't have time to process what that meant before the overhead PA crackled and Dr. Hargrove's voice came through, official and calm and carefully controlled. Attention all staff. Harlow General is activating a facility-wide administrative security protocol effective immediately. All non-essential personnel are asked to report to their department common areas for further instruction. This is a precautionary measure and does not indicate a patient care emergency. Thank you for your cooperation. The trauma unit went still for exactly 1 second. Then Deborah Finch appeared in the corridor doorway, and the look on her face was not the look of someone following a precautionary protocol. It was the look of someone who had just been told to do something she didn't agree with and was doing it anyway because the man who told her outranked her. "Mara," she said, "Dr. Hargrove is asking for you specifically. He'd like you to report to the administrative suite." Not a request. Mara stripped off her gloves. She looked at Dr. Ferris, who was still focused on her patient. Then she looked at the big man in the corridor with the tablet and the Harlow General logo on the screen. Then she looked at Deborah, whose eyes were saying, "I'm sorry," in a way her mouth wasn't allowed to. "Tell Dr. Hargrove I'll be right there," Mara said. And she meant it, just not for the reason he was expecting. Because she'd worked in places where people with fabricated credentials moved through systems they weren't supposed to have access to, and she'd worked in places where administrators cleared rooms right before something happened, and she'd worked in places where the people who tried to push her out were exactly the people who needed to be watched. And she had spent 3 years being quiet and careful and small, and she was very, very clear that this moment was the kind of moment those 3 years had been building toward without her permission. She walked out of the trauma bay. She did not go toward the administrative suite. She went to the emergency service entrance, the one the fake security team had come through that morning, and she stood in front of the door and looked at the keypad and the door frame and the specific pattern of scuff marks on the floor that told her this door had been propped, at some point, by something heavy placed on the outside. Someone had staged the access before the team arrived. Someone who was already inside the hospital. The door opened. Not from outside this time. From the corridor behind her, and when she turned, the commander was standing 8 feet away, and this time he wasn't giving instructions or maintaining protocol. He was simply looking at her with the cold, specific attention of a man who had decided she was a problem that needed to be managed. "Nurse Stanton," he said, "I think it's time we had a direct conversation." The fluorescent lights hummed above them. At the far end of the corridor, through the small, reinforced window in the stairwell door, Mara could see the red glow of an emergency indicator light that had not been lit when she started her shift. Something in this building had just been activated, and she was alone in a corridor with a man whose credentials were forged and whose team had just accessed the hospital's internal systems, and the door behind her was the only exit, and it required a code she knew, and he probably did too. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Sure," she said. "Let's talk." The commander's name, she learned in the first 90 seconds, was Brecht. He didn't offer it. She read it off the lanyard he wore clipped to the inside of his vest, a lanyard that was visible only because he'd shifted his weight left and the vest panel had pulled slightly open, and she noticed because she noticed everything, which was not a skill she'd developed as a nurse. He gestured toward a supply alcove off the main corridor, one of those narrow recessed spaces with shelving on 2 walls and a single overhead light, and she went in because refusing would have told him something she wasn't ready to tell him yet. "You've been creating friction since you came on shift," Brecht said. He stood in the alcove entrance rather than coming in beside her, which meant he was blocking the only exit, which he probably thought was a power position. It was, for most people. "I asked you which federal agency," Mara said. "That's not friction, that's a question. You flagged our credentials to administration. Your patches are wrong." He looked at her for a moment. His face was the kind of face that had learned to give very little away, not naturally blank, but trained blank. The specific flatness of someone who'd spent years in environments where showing something at the wrong moment had costs. She recognized it because she'd worn it herself. "Where did you serve?" he asked. She let the question sit. "You didn't learn to read insignia from nursing school," he said. "And the way you move through this building, you're not just checking rooms, you're clearing them. I'm doing my job. Your job doesn't include tactical pattern analysis." "Neither does yours, apparently," she said. "Your point man clears the corner before he checks the ceiling line. That's a training artifact from a controlled facility. You haven't worked dynamic environments in a while." Something shifted in him. Not much, just a fraction. The recalibration again, the same one she'd seen in the corridor that morning, but this time it went deeper. "You're going to make this difficult," he said. "I'm going to make it accurate," she said. "Which is different." He straightened, pulled the vest panel closed. Whatever opening had existed in that moment, whatever slim chance of a real conversation that could have gone somewhere useful, he closed it deliberately, the way you close a door you've decided not to walk through. "Dr. Hargrove is expecting you in the administrative suite," he said. "I'd encourage you not to make him wait any longer." He stepped back from the alcove entrance. She walked out. She went up the stairs instead of the elevator because the stairwell was the one space in the building she hadn't seen any of his team, and she needed 45 seconds to think without being watched. The red indicator light she'd seen through the stairwell window was on the second-floor landing, a small, wall-mounted panel that displayed the status of the hospital's emergency notification network, the system that connected Harlow General to regional dispatch, county emergency management, and the federal coordination protocols that activated when a hospital declared an internal emergency. The light was red because the outgoing notification function had been disabled. Not failed, not malfunctioned, disabled. There was a difference, and it was visible in the control panel status display if you knew what you were looking at. Someone had cut the hospital's ability to send an alert to the outside. She kept moving up the stairs. Dr. Aldrich Hargrove's office was on the third floor of the administrative wing, which was separated from the clinical building by a sky bridge that always felt colder than the rest of the hospital because nobody had ever properly insulated it. The door was open when she arrived, which she took as a sign that he wanted this to look casual. An open door suggested conversation rather than confrontation. It was a management technique she'd seen before. He was standing at the window when she came in, looking out over the hospital's east parking structure with his hands clasped behind him. "Close the door," he said. She did. "Sit down." She didn't. He turned, looked at her standing, made a small decision about whether to push it, then didn't. "I want to be direct with you," he said. "I'd appreciate that. You've been a disruptive presence in the trauma unit this morning. You questioned authorized personnel, you made allegations to department supervisors, and you've created a level of anxiety among staff that is actively unhelpful given the circumstances." "What are the circumstances?" she asked. He moved to his desk, didn't sit, stood at the edge of it, which put him slightly higher than her, which was deliberate. "Harlow General is in the middle of a sensitive security arrangement that I am not at liberty to discuss in detail. What I can tell you is that it has been authorized at the appropriate administrative levels, and that it is in the best interest of this hospital. The emergency notification network is disabled," she said. He went very still. "The outgoing alert function on the external notification panel. Second floor stairwell. It's been switched to disabled status. Not a malfunction, manual disable." She kept her voice even. "That means if something happens inside this hospital right now, nobody outside knows about it until someone physically leaves the building and makes a call. Which is a significant safety risk, and I think you know that. Nurse Stanton, I also think the security contractor you authorized doesn't exist in any verifiable federal database," she said. "I looked. The certifications on their company registration reference numbers that don't match any issued credentials, which means you either didn't verify them before authorizing their access, or you verified them and found the same thing I did and authorized them anyway." The silence in the room was not comfortable. "You're a nurse," he said. It came out differently than it had in the corridor that morning. Not dismissive this time. Heavier. Like he was reminding himself of something. "I'm a nurse," she agreed. "And I'm telling you that there are men in this building with forged credentials who have accessed our internal systems and disabled our emergency alert network, and I need to know if you understand what that means for the patients in this facility. The situation is under control." Whose control? He looked at her for a long moment. Something was working behind his eyes, calculation, or something that had started as calculation and was now curdling into something he didn't want to look at directly. "You're suspended," he said. She'd expected it. She'd expected it since the corridor that morning, if she was being honest, since the moment she'd told Deborah to look into the access code and seen the way Deborah's face had gone carefully neutral. "Effective immediately," he continued, "pending a review of your conduct this morning. Please surrender your access badge to security and leave the building." "You're suspending me," she said, "during an active trauma intake, with 2 critical patients in the unit and a staff that's already running short. Dr. Ferris is more than capable. I know she is. That's not the point." She took 1 step toward his desk. Not aggressive, just present. "The point is that you're removing me because I saw something you don't want me to see, and you're hoping I leave quietly. And I need you to think about what happens in this building if you're wrong about the people you let in." He held her gaze. She held his. "Your badge," he said. "Please." She unclipped it, set it on the edge of his desk without breaking eye contact. "I'll remember this conversation," she said. She walked out. She didn't leave the building. She went to the women's staff locker room on the 2nd floor, a place she knew the security team had not covered because it was at the end of a secondary corridor marked as non-clinical space. And she sat on the bench in front of her locker, and she gave herself exactly 4 minutes to be angry. Not to think, not to plan. Just to be angry, which she'd learned a long time ago was necessary if you didn't want it leaking out at the wrong moment. You had to give it its 4 minutes, acknowledge it, and then put it somewhere useful. She was angry because she was right. She was angry because being right hadn't mattered. She was angry because a man with authority and a button-down shirt and an office with a window view had looked at her and decided that a nurse's read on a tactical situation carried less weight than his arrangement with a company that existed on paper only, and there were patients in this building who were going to bear the cost of that calculation. 4 minutes. Then she opened her locker and took out her personal phone. She had 1 number she hadn't called in 3 years. She sat with the phone in her hands and thought about what calling that number would mean. It would mean pulling a thread she'd deliberately left alone. It would mean the conversation she'd spent 3 years not having. It would mean people she'd worked with knowing where she was and what name she was going by now, which wasn't her original name, but was a real name, a legal name she'd taken when she decided she was done with the other one. She also thought about the man in Bay 1 who had almost died on her table that morning, and the teenager in Bay 4 who'd looked at the tactical team in the corridor and said, "They look kind of intense for a hospital," and the look on Deborah Finch's face when she'd relayed Hargrove's order. She dialed. It rang twice. "Stanton," said a voice she hadn't heard in 3 years. It recognized her number. She'd kept the same number, which had probably been a mistake, but she'd kept it anyway for exactly this kind of reason, the kind of reason she'd told herself would never come up. "It's Mara," she said. A pause. Not surprise. The voice didn't do surprise. More like recalibration. "Where are you?" "Briar Falls, Harlow General Medical Center. I need you to run a contractor. Garrison Tactical Solutions, LLC. Domain registered 14 months ago. No physical address. Certifications that don't match any federal database." The sound of a keyboard, quick, practiced. "Mara, what are you into?" "I don't know yet. They have at least 6 personnel on site, forged federal credentials, access to the hospital's internal data systems, and they've disabled the external emergency notification network." She paused. "The chief administrator authorized their access personally, 2 weeks in advance." More keys, then. "Garrison Tactical doesn't exist. There's a shell registration in Delaware and nothing behind it." "That's what I found." "Who's running the on-site operation?" "A man named Brecht. At least that's what his lanyard said." A long pause. "Spell it." She did. "Give me 6 hours." "I don't have 6 hours," she said. "The hospital's communication network is down. Whatever they're here for, I think it's soon." "Then get out of the building. There are patients, Mara." The voice had the particular flatness of someone saying something they know won't land. "You know what I'm going to say." "I know. Get out." "I'll keep the line clear," she said, and hung up. She was back in the clinical building 4 minutes later, coming through the internal connection corridor that linked the administrative wing to the 2nd floor ward without passing through the main lobby. A route she knew because she'd walked every non-standard path in this building in her first 6 weeks, which her coworkers had attributed to enthusiasm for the job. The second floor was quieter than it should have been. Two of Brecht's men were still stationed at the ICU access corridor. The rotation pattern she'd clocked earlier should have brought replacements 8 minutes ago. It hadn't, which meant either the pattern had changed or the men were occupied elsewhere. She stopped at the second-floor nursing station, where a unit clerk named Petra, 24 years old, 3 months into the job, still startled by emergency pages, was staring at her computer screen with the expression of someone who has clicked on something they can't undo. "Petra?" Mara said quietly. "What's wrong?" "The patient record system." Petra turned the monitor slightly toward her. "It's been in read-only mode for the last 20 minutes. I can't update any charts. I can't access the medication orders module. It says," she pointed at the screen, "it says there's an administrative override in effect. Administrative override, which required either the highest level system credentials or an external access that had been granted those credentials by someone who had them. Hargrove, or someone who had Hargrove's access. Can you reach Dr. Ferris in the trauma unit?" Mara asked. "I've been trying. The internal phone line to the trauma bay is going to voicemail." Internal phones going to voicemail in an active trauma unit didn't happen by accident. "Keep trying," Mara said. "And don't leave this station." She moved toward the stairwell. She was halfway down the second-floor corridor when she heard it. Not loud, not the kind of sound that made people stop what they were doing and look around, but the kind of sound that she'd been trained to identify precisely because it was quiet. A door closing hard in a space where doors didn't close hard. Something heavy shifting against a floor. The specific resonance of movement in a space that wasn't designed for the number of people currently in it. It was coming from below. From the trauma unit. She took the stairs at a pace that wasn't running because running in a hospital told everyone something was wrong, and she needed 30 more seconds before anyone knew something was wrong. The trauma unit doors came into view. Through the reinforced window in the stairwell door, she could see the corridor. She could see Dr. Ferris at the nursing station. She could see the Bay 1 patient's monitors through the bay window, still running, still green. She could also see that there were now 4 of Brecht's men in the trauma corridor, not 2, and that 2 of them had moved to positions on either side of the trauma bay entrance in a formation that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with preventing someone from leaving. And she could see Brecht. He was standing at the nursing station, and he had a document in his hand, and he was showing it to Dr. Ferris. And whatever was on that document had drained the color from Ferris's face in a way that active trauma never had. Because Ferris had been doing this for 22 years, and she was not a woman who lost color. Mara pushed through the stairwell door and walked toward them. Brecht heard her before he saw her. He turned. "You were asked to leave," he said. "I was suspended," she said. "Not arrested. I still have rights in this building. You surrendered your access badge. And I'm still standing here." She stopped 6 feet from him, close enough to see the document he was holding. It had Harlow General's letterhead and the signature she recognized as Hargrove's at the bottom. "What is that?" Ferris answered before Brecht could. "He says it's a transfer authorization. He wants to move both critical patients out of the trauma bay." She had her arms crossed and her jaw set in the particular way of a physician who has decided to hold a position. "He's saying it's for their safety." "Transfer them to where?" Mara asked. "He won't specify a receiving facility." Mara looked at Brecht. "You want to move 2 critical patients, one of whom we nearly lost 2 hours ago, to an unspecified location on the authority of a document signed by an administrator. The authorization is valid. Critical patients in unstable condition cannot be transferred to an unspecified location. That violates basic patient care protocol and federal patient safety standards." She stepped forward. "And Dr. Ferris, as attending physician, has the clinical authority to refuse that transfer." "I do," Ferris said immediately. "This isn't a medical decision," Brecht started. "It is exactly a medical decision," Mara said, "and you don't have the authority to override it." The 4 men in the corridor had all turned to watch. Brecht's jaw tightened. Not much, but she saw it. "Last chance, Nurse Stanton," he said. "Leave the building. Whatever happens here is no longer your concern." And that, "whatever happens here," was the phrase she'd been waiting for. Because it wasn't the language of a security contractor managing a facility protocol. It was the language of a man managing an operation, and the phrase assumed something was going to happen, which meant whatever they were here for hadn't happened yet, which meant she still had time. She looked at Ferris. Don't sign anything and don't move those patients. Then she looked at Brecht. You're not getting those patients. The moment held, and then the overhead PA crackled. Not Dr. Hargrove's voice this time, not the measured administrative tone of a planned announcement, but a burst of static, then a voice she recognized as belonging to the charge nurse from the main intake desk, and the voice was not calm. Code yellow, all units. Code yellow. Emergency management team to the main entrance. We have an unresponsive patient in the ambulance bay. No EMS on site. Repeat, unresponsive patient, no EMS. Main ambulance bay. Code yellow. An unresponsive patient with no accompanying medical team, which meant no handoff information, no medical history, nothing except a person who needed help. Every clinical instinct she had pulled toward the ambulance bay. Every tactical instinct she had said, this is the distraction. She looked at Brecht. He wasn't moving toward the PA speaker. He wasn't reacting to the code. He was watching her, reading her, waiting to see which direction she'd go. And in the 8 seconds she stood there deciding, something happened that neither of them had planned for. The emergency service entrance at the far end of the trauma corridor, the same door the team had come through that morning, the door with the scuff marks and the bypassed lock, opened. Not from outside, from the interior side. And the 2 men who walked through were not wearing black tactical vests. They were wearing military utility uniforms with insignia that was exactly right, thread color correct, font correct, unit designation accurate, and they were not alone. Behind them came 4 more. And behind them, a woman in civilian clothes with a federal identification card visible on a lanyard at her collar, moving with the specific efficiency of someone who had already assessed the room before she entered it. She looked at the tactical team. She looked at Brecht. Then she looked at Mara. And she said, "We've been trying to reach this facility for 40 minutes. Someone want to tell me why the external notification network is down?" The trauma corridor went absolutely silent. Brecht did not move. And Mara thought, very clearly, they found us. But the look on the federal agent's face as her eyes moved from Mara's face to Brecht's and back again was not the look of someone who had simply responded to a hospital security incident. It was the look of someone who had found something they weren't expecting to find, something that made the agent take one more step into the corridor and say, quietly, directly at Mara, "I know who you are." The agent's name was Voss. Special Agent Denise Voss, Department of Justice, Financial Crimes and Contractor Fraud Division, and she had a way of standing in a room that made the room feel like it belonged to her within about 45 seconds of her entering it. She was looking at Mara with recognition that went deeper than a name on a file. "We should talk," Voss said, separately. She glanced at Brecht without looking at him directly, the particular kind of not looking that communicated she was tracking every micro-movement he made. "After we secure this corridor." 2 of the military personnel had already moved to flank Brecht's position, not with weapons drawn, but with the specific body placement that made drawing a weapon a significantly worse option than standing still. The other 4 had spread through the corridor with the efficiency of people who had been briefed on the floor plan before they arrived. Brecht had gone very still. Not the trained stillness of a tactical professional. The stillness of a man running calculations and finding that the numbers weren't working. "Garrison Tactical is operating under a valid administrative authorization," he said. His voice was steady. She gave him credit for that. "Garrison Tactical Solutions, LLC," Voss said, "was incorporated 14 months ago by a holding company registered to a Delaware address that hasn't had a physical tenant in 6 years. The certifications on file are fabricated. The personnel operating under its name are doing so on forged federal contractor credentials." She produced her own identification, real, verifiable, the kind with embedded security features that reflected correctly under the fluorescent lights. "You want to tell me who you actually work for, or would you like to do that part somewhere with better recording equipment?" Brecht said nothing. "Right." Voss looked at the military team lead, a compact man with a sergeant's bearing and the specific kind of weathered calm that came from having been in genuinely dangerous places. "Sergeant Aldis, secure the personnel." "Ma'am." Aldis moved. Brecht's team did not resist. Mara watched them and noted the way they stood down, not with surprise, not with the reactive aggression of men who hadn't expected to be caught, but with the resigned compliance of people who had been told this was a possible outcome and had been given instructions for how to handle it. which meant whoever was running this operation had planned for exposure, which meant exposure wasn't the end of it. Voss turned fully to Mara and walked her 6 steps toward the bay windows away from the controlled chaos of the corridor. Mara Stanton, Voss said, formerly Mara Delacroix. Trauma medic, 75th Combat Support Medical Company, attached to a Special Operations Evacuation Unit out of Fort Hale, deployed in 3 combat rotations before separation in, I know my own record, Mara said. I know you do. Voss's voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't soft either. I also know you've spent 3 years not talking to anyone who might be able to put your name in a document, so I need you to understand that we are not here because of you. We were tracking Garrison Tactical before this morning. We just didn't know they were here until your contact called in 40 minutes ago. Mara absorbed that. What are they after? Patient records. Voss said it plainly, like she'd given up on building to it. Specifically, the records of a patient admitted to this facility 6 days ago under a non-disclosure protocol. Civilian identity, federal witness protection, admitted for cardiac surgery. The records exist in your system under a flagged administrative file that requires dual-key authorization to access. The administrative override, Mara said. They put the system in read-only mode because they were in the process of copying the dual-key file structure to an external device before they triggered the access that would have flagged the system. If they'd gotten the file intact, they could have identified the patient's location, current identity, and post-surgical care timeline. Voss paused. Which would have told certain people exactly how to find someone who put certain other people in a federal courtroom. The weight of it settled. A witness. A protected witness with a cardiac condition, 6 days post-surgery, somewhere in this building, and a team of men with forged credentials who had walked through the front of the hospital with an administrator's help to get to one file. Hargrove, Mara said, was approached 8 weeks ago. Voss's jaw was tight. He was told he was participating in a legitimate security arrangement. By the time he understood it wasn't legitimate, he'd already provided access credentials and building codes. After that, they had enough on him to make sure he stayed cooperative. He knew they weren't who they said they were, Mara said. He knew by last week. He chose not to report it. Because they had him. Because he made a series of decisions over 8 weeks that he knew would look exactly as bad as they were. Voss looked at her evenly. That's not your problem to solve right now. The problem right now is that we secured 6 of Garrison's personnel in this corridor, and our pre-operation intelligence counted 8. Mara felt it before Voss finished the sentence. 2 are unaccounted for. The code yellow, Voss said. Unresponsive patient, no EMS, ambulance bay. It went out on your PA 4 minutes ago. That was the distraction, Mara said. I flagged it when it happened. It was also cover. The 2 missing personnel used the staff response movement to reposition. We think they went deeper into the building. Toward the protected patient. Toward the protected patient's location, yes, which we're not disclosing to anyone in this facility, for obvious reasons. Voss looked at her. But whoever built their operational plan knew the floor layout well enough to route around security checkpoints. They had inside information about more than just the data system. Mara thought about the scuff marks on the emergency entrance floor. The door that had been propped before the team arrived. Someone inside the building, ahead of the operation. Not Hargrove. Hargrove was a credential, not a tactician, someone who had done physical reconnaissance. How long has your investigation been running? She asked. 11 months? Have you been inside this building before today? Voss's expression shifted slightly. Not guilt. Something more considered than that. We conducted a site assessment 6 weeks ago. Did your assessment include patient ward access? A pause. Why? Because someone propped the emergency service entrance before Breck's team arrived this morning. From the inside. The scuff pattern on the floor is consistent with a heavy object placed from the interior side, which means someone in this building helped stage that access. And if it wasn't Hargrove because Hargrove isn't tactical, she let that hang. Voss pulled out her phone. She stepped away, made a call that lasted 20 seconds, listened, and came back with an expression that was carefully controlled. We need to move, she said. Now. They went up. Not because the protected patient was necessarily on an upper floor, Voss hadn't confirmed anything, but because the 2 unaccounted-for Garrison personnel had been last seen near the stairwell that serviced the North Wing, and the North Wing housed the post-surgical recovery ward. Mara moved with Voss and two of the military personnel, Aldous and a younger specialist named Ruiz, who had the economical movement of someone who'd trained specifically for confined spaces. They went up the north stairwell in a tight column, checking landings, and Mara was aware of the specific surreal quality of moving through a hospital she had worked in for 3 years, with her body doing things she had spent 3 years pretending it didn't know how to do. The second-floor landing was clear. The third-floor landing had a fire door propped open with a folded piece of cardboard. Aldous looked at it, looked at Mara. "That's not hospital staff," she said. "They use doorstops, not cardboard." He nodded. Ruiz took the left side of the door frame. Aldous took the right. Mara stayed back because she was not armed, and she was aware of that in the specific way you became aware of things you'd once taken for granted. They moved through. The North Wing post-surgical ward was a long corridor with patient rooms on both sides, a nursing station at the center, and an equipment alcove at the far end. It was quiet in the way hospital wards are quiet at mid-morning, when procedures are running and patients are resting and the nursing staff is managing charts and medication rounds. Except the nursing station was empty, which it shouldn't be, not completely. Voss touched Mara's arm and pointed left without speaking. Mara looked. The nursing station's medication cart was pulled halfway out of its dock and left there, which meant whoever had been working it had left in a hurry or been moved in a hurry. At the far end of the corridor, the equipment alcove door was slightly open. Aldous and Ruiz moved toward it. Voss and Mara moved toward the nursing station to check the status board, a whiteboard that listed room numbers, patient identifiers, and attending nurse names. Mara scanned it for anything flagged differently from the others. Any room with a different designation or restricted notation. Room 3118. All the other rooms had patient initials. Room 318 had a 4-digit code instead of initials, which was not standard Harlow General notation, which meant someone had added a non-standard flag to that room's listing and either hadn't thought to hide it fully or had done so quickly enough to make a mistake. Voss saw it at the same moment. From the equipment alcove, a sound. Not a crash, not a shout, something smaller. A voice, pushed low, strained. Aldous came back from the alcove doorway. "Ward nurse, she was locked in. She's okay." Behind him, a woman in her 50s in scrubs with her hair pulled back unevenly, the evidence of a bun that had been disrupted, came into the corridor. She was breathing harder than her movement suggested she should be, the aftermath of adrenaline. "Two men," she said. "They came from the stairwell. They showed me a document, said they needed patient access for a security transfer, and when I said I had to call it in, they locked me in the alcove." She stopped. "Room 318. They went to room 318. Everyone moved. The door to room 318 was closed. Aldous put his back to the wall left of the door. Ruiz mirrored on the right. Voss had her weapon out. Mara hadn't seen her draw it. It had simply appeared, and was positioned at an angle that gave her a sightline to the door's swing path without putting her directly in front of it. Mara stood 6 feet back and calculated. Room 318 was a private post-surgical room. Standard layout. Door opened inward on the right, bed against the left wall. Monitoring equipment right of the bed, window facing the east parking structure on the opposite wall. 2 people in that room plus a patient who was 6 days post-cardiac surgery and whose physical capacity was essentially 0. If the 2 garrison personnel were trying to extract a patient record physically, a secondary device, a drive, something they'd planted in the room during a prior access, they needed the room quiet. If they were trying to extract the patient, they needed more than 2 people, and they didn't have more than 2 people anymore. If they were there for something else entirely. Voss knocked. 3 sharp raps. "Federal agent, open the door." Silence. "You have 10 seconds. Your colleagues are in custody downstairs. The exit routes are secured. Open the door." 7 seconds. Then the door opened. The man who opened it was not one of Brecht's men. He was wearing hospital scrubs, green, the color of the surgical recovery ward staff, and he had a Harlow General ID badge clipped at his collar. And he was of medium height and build with a face that was forgettable in the specific way that made Mara certain it had been cultivated rather than inherited, and he said calmly, "Can I help you?" Voss kept her weapon up. "Hands." He raised them, slowly, showing open palms. "Step out of the room." He did. 1 step, 2 steps, into the corridor, and Ruiz was on him immediately, and it was only as his hands came behind him that Mara had a clear line of sight through the open door into room 318, and what she saw was the patient in the bed, a man who appeared to be in his late 60s, monitors attached, IV running, face pale and damp in the way of someone managing post-surgical discomfort, eyes open and frightened. And on the floor to the left of the door, a second man, the second missing garrison operative, who was sitting with his back to the wall and both hands pressed against a cut above his eye, bleeding steadily enough that the front of his tactical undershirt was marked with it. And beside him, standing with her weight balanced and a monitor cable looped twice around her left hand in a way that transformed it into something that could do real damage, was a woman Mara had never seen before. She was small, maybe 5'4", with graying hair and the careful stillness of someone managing pain. She had one arm wrapped slightly around her own midsection, which suggested she might have cracked something in the process of putting a trained operative on the floor, and she was breathing in a specific pattern. Controlled. Deliberate. The kind of pattern you learned when pain was something you'd decided not to let make decisions for you. She looked at Mara, at Voss, at the uniformed personnel in the corridor. "About time," she said. "What?" The next 40 minutes were controlled chaos of a specific institutional variety, the kind that involved federal agents and hospital security and two critical patients who still needed medical attention regardless of what was happening around them, and a hospital administrator who was currently in his office on the third floor with two Department of Justice personnel who were not asking him how his morning was going. Mara moved. She wasn't authorized to be doing anything in this building. She had surrendered her access badge. She was technically suspended by an administrator who was himself currently being investigated, which created an interesting question about the validity of that suspension. But she didn't have time to think about the legality of it, because the man in room 318 had a cardiac monitor showing rhythm irregularities that had worsened in the last 20 minutes, probably secondary to the stress event of having two operatives enter his room, and the woman with the cracked rib situation needed imaging and assessment regardless of her decision not to acknowledge that she was in pain. She found Petra from the second-floor station and sent her for the crash cart as a precaution. She found Dr. Ferris in the trauma bay and briefed her in 40 seconds. The way briefings worked when you didn't have more than 40 seconds. Ferris said, "You're suspended. Hargrove's in custody." A beat. "What do you need?" Ferris asked. "Cardiology consult in 318, stat. And someone with imaging who can look at a possible rib fracture on an unknown patient who will probably refuse to admit she has a rib fracture." "Go," Ferris said. Mara went. She was in the corridor outside 318 when Voss found her. "The man in scrubs," Voss said without preamble. "I was already in the building. He's been here for 4 days." "Embedded," Mara said, "as a ward orderly. His credentials checked against the hospital HR system because someone in HR input them." Voss paused. "We're running down who in HR. Point is, he had room access, he had patient location, and he'd already retrieved the secondary device from the room. The drive. Small external storage unit planted in the room's utility panel during the original site assessment. He had it on him when Ruiz detained him." She looked at Mara steadily. "He also had a second device. A jammer. Localized signal disruption would have taken down the monitoring equipment in 318 for approximately 90 seconds. 90 seconds of flatline monitoring for a 6 days post-surgery cardiac patient. That's not data extraction," Mara said. "No," Voss said. "It's not." The shape of it was worse than she'd thought. It hadn't been about finding the patient. It had been about making sure the patient didn't survive to testify. "Did he activate it?" she asked. "No, the patient—" Voss paused. "The patient's companion stopped him before he could. The woman with the monitor cable and the cracked rib." "Who is she?" Voss considered. "Not my information to give, but she's been with him since the 3rd day. She requested overnight clearance and she wasn't supposed to be there, technically, but the nurse on the ward let it go." She said it without judgment, because sometimes nurses let things go for the right reasons. Mara nodded. She went into room 318. The patient looked at her with the exhausted wariness of someone who had been afraid for a long time and had developed a working relationship with it. The monitors showed PVCs, premature ventricular contractions, stress-induced, not immediately dangerous, but not something to leave unmanaged. She checked his IV line, checked his BP manually because she trusted the cuff more than the automated read right now, and noted the number. Higher than it should be, lower than it could be. "I'm a nurse," she said. "My name is Mara. The people who came into your room are in custody." He looked at her for a moment, then said hoarsely, "How many were there?" "On site, 8, all secured." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the particular quality of his fear had shifted. Not gone, not even close to gone, but rearranged. "She's okay." Mara assumed he meant the woman with the cracked rib. "She's being assessed." She held her own. Something crossed his face that might have been pride if it hadn't been so tired. "You need to rest," Mara said, "and not because someone's telling you to, because your heart has had a genuinely bad morning and it needs you to stop working against it." He almost smiled. "You have a way with patience." "I'm told that," she said. She was adjusting his monitoring lead placement. One had shifted during the disruption, when she became aware that someone was standing in the doorway. She turned. It was Aldous, the sergeant. He had his hands loose at his sides and his weight settled back slightly, which she'd noticed was the way he stood when he wasn't in an active operational mode, and he was looking at her with an expression she didn't immediately categorize. "You were attached to a SOET unit," he said. "Special Operations Evacuation, Fort Hale." She finished with the lead. "I was." "Rotation 2, Kandahar Province." She looked at him. "You pulled a 4-man team out of a collapsed structure under fire," he said, "in a window where the evacuation bird had already been called back, and you had 6 minutes before the QRF on the other side of that ridge was going to find the position." She hadn't thought about that day in a long time. She thought about it now, briefly, and it had the quality that old things had when you'd processed them fully and filed them, and they no longer had the power to knock you sideways, though they never entirely lost their weight. "I didn't know anyone remembered that," she said. "Third man out of that structure," Aldous said. "That was my brother." She looked at him. He held her gaze for a moment, not asking for anything, not making it more than it was, just acknowledging. "He made it home," Aldous said. "Got out 2 years after that. He's in Portland now. He's got 2 kids." She didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. Aldous nodded, a single, compact acknowledgement, and stepped back from the doorway. She stood in room 318 with the cardiac patient's monitors running steady behind her, and thought about the particular strange ways that things connected through time, the threads you didn't see until they pulled taut, and how the worst moments of your life could somehow become the reason someone else's story had a different ending. Then she pushed it back down, because she wasn't done yet. By 1 in the afternoon, Harlow General looked like a different building. Federal vehicles in the parking structure. DOJ personnel in the administrative wing. 2 members of Breck's team, who had requested legal counsel, were waiting in the administrative conference room with Agent Voss's colleagues. The remaining personnel were processed in the main lobby with the kind of efficiency that came from having done this before in a building they'd already mapped. Brecht himself had said nothing since the corridor. He sat with his hands in his lap, and the specific composure of a man who had decided that his only remaining asset was silence, and he was protecting it the way some people protected money. Dr. Hargrove had been escorted from his office at 11:20. Mara hadn't seen it happen. She'd been in the post-surgical ward, but Deborah Finch had, and when Mara found Deborah at the trauma unit nursing station at 1:15, Deborah had the look of someone who had watched something inevitable finally arrive. "How are you doing?" Mara asked her. Deborah thought about it genuinely, which was something Mara respected about her. "I'm angry," she said. "I'm angry that I followed his instructions this morning. I'm angry that I sent you up to his office. You didn't know what he was." "I knew something was wrong," Deborah said. "I chose not to know more specifically." Mara didn't reassure her, because she was right, and Deborah knew it, and meaningless reassurance in that situation was its own small dishonesty. "You kept trying to reach Ferris when the phones went down, Petra told me." "Not fast enough." "It was enough," Mara said. Deborah looked at her. "What happens now?" "Investigation. Review of everyone Hargrove brought in or approved. Security audit of the system access." She paused. "And someone needs to run the trauma unit while administration is sorted out. Ferris can act as clinical lead." "She can," Mara said. "She'll need a charge nurse." Deborah straightened slightly. Not because the suggestion surprised her, but because she'd needed to hear it said by someone else. I should check on the Bay 1 patient, she said. He's stable. Ferris updated me at noon. The teenager in 4 went home at 10. I know, I saw him leave. He waved. They stood for a moment in the trauma bay doorway with the familiar sounds of the unit around them. Monitors, ventilators, the low, persistent rhythm of a working medical space. And it felt steadier than it had all morning, more like itself. Then Voss appeared at the end of the corridor, walking toward them with the purpose of someone who has a new problem. She stopped in front of Mara. We have a situation, she said. The external storage device that the embedded operative was carrying. We have it, we've secured it, and our technical team is working through what he accessed. She paused. He got further into the system than we initially assessed. He wasn't just in the protected file. He was in the patient billing records, the staff employment database, and... She stopped again. And what? Mara asked. Voss looked at her with the expression of someone delivering something they'd rather not. He was in the personnel files, staff records, full employment history, background check documentation, prior employment verification. She met Mara's eyes. Your file, Mara. Your full file. Everything Harlow General's HR has on you, which includes the background check documentation your contact provided when you came here 3 years ago, which includes whatever identity paperwork was processed at that time. Mara went very still. He copied it? She asked. We don't know yet what he transmitted before we secured the device, Voss said. Our technical team is working to determine if there was any outbound transfer before the jammer was recovered. 3 years of careful, deliberate quiet. 3 years of a different name, a different city, a different life assembled from the parts of herself she'd chosen to keep. Who would he have transmitted it to? Mara asked. Voss's expression didn't change. The people who hired Garrison Tactical Solutions. The people who wanted the protected patient to not survive his testimony. She paused. The people who would have a significant interest in knowing that the person who helped stop their operation today has a history they're not currently known by. The monitoring equipment hummed behind them. The trauma unit was running. The patients were stable. The building was full of federal agents who had done their jobs. And somewhere on an outbound server that Voss's technical team was racing to trace, there might be a file with a name Mara hadn't used in 3 years, attached to a new name, attached to an address, attached to a face that the wrong people now knew to look for. Mara looked at the floor for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked at Voss. Tell me what you need from me, she said. Voss opened her mouth to answer, and her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Something in her face changed in a way Mara had not seen it change all morning, a specific tightening around the eyes. That was not operational focus, but something closer to the thing that happened when a situation became worse in a way you hadn't fully anticipated. She answered it, listened for 10 seconds. And then she looked at Mara and said, The technical team found the outbound transfer log. It went to one recipient. She lowered the phone. And that recipient accessed the file 47 minutes ago. 47 minutes ago. Before Brecht was in custody. Before the corridor was secured. Before any of this was contained. Where was the access point? Mara asked. That's the problem, Voss said. The access point is inside this building. Inside this building. Mara processed that in the time it took Voss to lower her phone, which was about 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, she did what she'd been trained to do with information that changed the picture. She didn't argue with it. She didn't ask for confirmation. She simply restructured everything she knew around the new fact and looked at what the restructuring revealed. 8 Garrison personnel on site, 6 secured in the trauma corridor, the man in scrubs detained outside room 318, the second operative taken down by the patient's companion inside the room. That was 8. 8 accounted for, 8 in custody, which meant the access point inside the building wasn't a 9th Garrison operative. It was someone who had been here the whole time. Your technical team, Mara said. Can they narrow the access point to a specific terminal? Voss was already typing something into her phone. They're working it. How many terminals in this building have access to the staff employment database? Administration, HR, and department-level supervisor stations. Department-level supervisor stations. Mara thought about the nursing station on the 2nd floor, the one Petra had been working when the record system went into administrative override. The one with the monitor she'd turned slightly to show the read-only error. The one that had a department supervisor login level because charge nurses needed it to access employment verification for scheduling and credential management. She thought about who had access to that station. Deborah, she said. Not an accusation, just a name arriving in her mind with the weight of something she didn't want to be true but couldn't dismiss. Voss looked at her. What about her? Charge nurse, 11 years in the building. She has supervisor-level system access. She knows the floor layouts, the rotation schedules, the staff patterns. Mara stopped. She's the one who told me Hargrove authorized the access code personally, like she was giving me information, like she wanted me to know. Or like she was controlling what you knew, Voss said. She sent me to Hargrove's office herself, which moved you out of the trauma corridor at a specific time. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Where is she now? Voss asked. Mara turned to look down the corridor. The Trauma Bay nursing station, where she had left Deborah Finch standing not 12 minutes ago, was empty. Voss moved fast and quietly in a way that belied the business formal clothing, and Mara kept pace because she knew this building and Voss didn't, not at the level of knowing where the dead ends were and which corridors connected to what, and where a person who needed to not be found would go if they'd spent 11 years learning every square foot of it. She'd go for an exit that isn't monitored, Mara said as they moved. The loading dock on the south side. Staff use it for supply deliveries. It's not covered by the main security camera grid because the cameras on that side have been in a maintenance request backlog for 8 months. How do you know that? I put in 2 of the requests. Voss relayed the south loading dock to her team via radio in 6 words and kept walking. They took the south corridor, which ran parallel to the main trauma wing, and connected through a supply passage that smelled like antiseptic and the particular dusty cold of spaces that were functional rather than occupied. Mara pushed through the supply passage door, and they were in the loading area, a wide concrete space with a rolling steel door currently closed, fluorescent strip lighting overhead, and a row of supply shelving along the right wall. Deborah was at the personnel exit door on the far left wall. She had her hand on the bar and she turned when she heard them come in, and the expression on her face was the most honest thing Mara had seen from her all day, which was the problem with expressions like that. They confirmed things you'd rather not have confirmed. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was something older than guilt. The particular fatigue of someone who has been carrying a thing for a long time and has finally run out of the energy required to keep carrying it upright. Deborah, Mara said. Deborah took her hand off the door bar. Don't, Deborah said. Her voice was level. Not the careful level of someone performing calm, but the actual level of someone on the other side of the moment they'd been dreading. Don't do the thing where you look at me like I'm someone you don't recognize. You recognized what Hargrove was this morning by the way he held his shoulders. So recognize this too and just... She stopped. Just say it straight. You accessed the personnel file, Mara said, after the transfer. 45 minutes ago, yes. And transmitted it. Deborah nodded once. To who? I don't know his real name. She said it without deflection, which made it worse rather than better. I was approached 4 months ago. A man who said he represented a legal consulting group working on a medical liability case. He needed internal staff records for a deposition, and he said the hospital's legal team had stonewalled the request, and he was going around them. She paused. He paid me. The first time. And then the second time he paid me less because by then he didn't need to pay me the full amount anymore. He needed to pay me enough to remind me what I'd already done. The specific architecture of coercion. Do a thing, then be owned by the thing you did. What did you give him? Voss asked. She'd come to stand slightly to Mara's left, and her voice had the deliberate neutrality of an investigator who had decided the most useful thing she could do right now was not interrupt the momentum of honesty. 3 months ago, the patient census for the post-surgical ward. Names, room assignments, procedure codes. Deborah's hands were at her sides. I didn't know why he wanted it. I told myself I didn't know. I knew. She looked at Mara. I knew by the 2nd month, and I didn't stop. The patient in 318, Mara said. The census data would have told them he was here. The room number, the post-operative timeline. Deborah's voice didn't waver, but something behind it did. I knew what they were going to do with it, not the specifics. But enough. Mara looked at her. This woman who had been in this building for 11 years, who had trained 3 generations of trauma unit nurses, who had called every medication error and patient complaint and staffing crisis with the steadiness of someone who had made the job the architecture of her life, and who had, somewhere in the last 4 months, started making different decisions for reasons that probably seemed manageable at first, and had compounded into something she couldn't undo. "The file you transmitted 45 minutes ago," Voss said. "My staff identity record." Deborah looked at the floor. "Yes." "To the same contact?" "Yes. He messaged me this morning, after the federal personnel arrived. He said the operation had been compromised, and he needed anything he could get on the individuals involved in the response. I had supervisor access. Your file was in the employment database because you were cross-listed as a contractor liaison." She paused. "I know that doesn't help you." "No," Mara said. "It doesn't." "Did the transmission complete?" Voss asked. "I don't know. I sent it, and then Deborah stopped. "I came down here." Voss was on her radio again. Mara watched Deborah, who was looking at the concrete floor with the particular stillness of someone who had reached the end of a road they'd been walking for long enough that they couldn't clearly remember where they'd started. 11 years, Mara said, not as a judgment, more like she was trying to understand the arithmetic of it. 11 years, Deborah confirmed, and 4 months of being someone I didn't think I was. She finally looked up. "I'm sorry for this morning, for sending you to his office. You wanted me out of the way. I wanted you safe." Her voice broke slightly on the word. Just slightly. Just enough. "They told me if any staff interfered with the operation, the contact would make sure the interference was dealt with. I thought if you were upstairs, in administration, away from it, you thought you were protecting me. I thought I was protecting everyone, which is what people tell themselves." She said the last part with a flatness that was the clearest sign of intelligence Mara had seen from her since the morning started. The ability to diagnose your own delusion out loud. Voss lowered her radio. "Transmission was intercepted by our technical team before delivery. The file didn't reach the recipient." She looked at Deborah. "You're going to want to call an attorney." Deborah nodded. She didn't look relieved about the transmission. She didn't look anything except tired. "I'll go wherever you need me to go," she said. The next 2 hours dismantled things. That was the only word for it. Not rebuilt, not resolved, but dismantled, piece by piece. The machinery of what Garrison Tactical Solutions had built inside Harlow General over 8 weeks and 4 months, and one embedded operative who'd worked the ward in green scrubs for 4 days without anyone looking at him hard enough to ask questions. Voss's team worked through the hospital's server room with a forensics specialist who had the focused, slightly impatient energy of someone who spoke primarily in data and found human conversation inefficient. They pulled access logs, transfer records, the complete trail of what had been looked at, and when, and from which terminal. The picture that emerged was more organized than Mara had expected, and more ordinary, which was somehow worse. No single dramatic hack, no sophisticated breach, just the slow accumulation of authorized access used for unauthorized purposes. An administrator's credentials here, a supervisor's login there. A consultant's cover story repeated 4 months of monthly payments until it didn't need to be repeated anymore because the hook was set. Hargrove, in the conference room with 2 DOJ attorneys and a federal prosecutor who had driven up from the regional office and arrived at 2:15, said very little for the first 40 minutes, and then said a great deal. Mara wasn't in the room. She had no reason to be. But Voss came out at 3:20 with the expression of someone whose afternoon had become significantly more complicated in ways she found professionally satisfying. "He kept records," Voss said. Mara looked at her. Hargrove kept records. 8 weeks of communications, encrypted, on a personal device not connected to the hospital system. "I thought he was protecting himself." She paused. "He was. From them. He was building a file in case he needed leverage. The problem for him is that the file documents his own participation in enough detail to be useful to us, and not useful to him." "What did he get from them?" Mara asked. "Originally, before it became coercion. Money, initially. A consulting arrangement, fake, structured to look like a legitimate healthcare advisory contract. And they had something on him from before the hospital. A previous administrative position, financial irregularities that had been quietly settled. They used it to open the door and then they walked through it. So he was Deborah's situation, 6 years earlier. Essentially, except he had more authority, which made him more valuable, which made them more careful about keeping him cooperative rather than just squeezing him. Voss shook her head slightly. He's in a genuinely complicated legal position. He's a cooperating witness and a defendant simultaneously, which is a situation lawyers bill a lot of hours managing. The patient in 318, Mara said. He's protected? His protective detail arrived at 2 o'clock. The testimony timeline hasn't changed. Voss looked at her. The operation failed. Whatever they were trying to prevent, they failed to prevent it. That should have felt cleaner than it did. It felt like the end of something that had caused damage in the process of being stopped, which was how most things ended when you were honest about them. At 4 o'clock, the man in Bay 1, the truck accident patient, the one whose BP had dropped to 60 over palp during the resuscitation, the one she'd kept on this side of the line through 11 minutes of controlled crisis, was moved to the ICU for monitoring. The transport team came from upstairs, and when they wheeled him past the nursing station, he was awake, and he looked at Mara, and he said, "You were here this morning." "I was," she said. "You kept talking to me when I was—" He stopped. "I could hear you. Just your voice. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew someone was there." She nodded. "That's the point." "Thank you," he said. She watched them take him down the corridor. Ferris came to stand beside her. "You should go home," Ferris said. "You've been here since 5:15. I'm not authorized to be here at all, technically. You were unsuspended at 2:45 when administration confirmed Hargrove's removal and an interim director was contacted." Ferris looked at her sideways. "The interim director reinstated all actions taken under Hargrove's authority to pending review, which means your suspension is under review, which means it's not currently in effect, which means you are technically on shift and have been for 11 hours and should go home." "When you put it that way," Mara said, "go home. Come back tomorrow. There will still be patients." She went to the locker room. She changed out of her scrubs. She sat on the bench for a moment with her personal phone in her hand and thought about calling the number she'd called this morning, which she'd been careful not to think about since the loading dock, because that call had consequences she was going to have to manage, and she wasn't ready to manage them today. She put the phone in her pocket. She was almost at the staff exit when Voss caught her. "One more thing," Voss said. Mara stopped. "The contact. Deborah's contact. Hargrove's original approach. The overall operation. We have a name now. From Hargrove's records." She paused. "His name is Prescott. Warren Prescott. He runs a private intelligence firm out of 3 shell companies in 2 states, and he's been building dossiers on federal witnesses and protective program participants for at least 6 years. Garrison Tactical is one of several operational arms. He has others." Mara understood what Voss was telling her. Not just what Prescott's organization had done here. What it meant that a man with 6 years of experience building dossiers had now received, or attempted to receive, a file with her name on it. "Is he in custody?" she asked. "Not yet. We know who he is. We're working on where he is." "How long?" "Hours to days. We have a federal warrant. He won't be in the country long if he's smart." "He's been operating for 6 years, Mara said. "He's smart." Voss met her eyes. "We're aware of that. And until he's in custody, someone who worked to expose his operation today has a file with 2 names on it in his possession. We'll have protective arrangements." "I don't need protective arrangements," Mara said. It came out more bluntly than she intended, but it was accurate. "I need Prescott in a room with federal charges and no operating bandwidth. That's what I need." Voss looked at her steadily. "We're working on it." Mara nodded. She believed her. She also believed that working on it and done were 2 different things, and the distance between them was a space she was going to have to inhabit carefully. She went home. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted building 6 blocks from the hospital, small and orderly, in the way of someone who had lived in environments where disorder had costs, with plants on the windowsill that were alive because she paid attention to them, and a kitchen that showed evidence of actual cooking rather than takeout survival. She had built this space deliberately, and she was aware, walking into it at 5:40, that it felt different than it had when she left it this morning. Not the apartment, her relationship to it. She made food she didn't particularly taste and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and ran the name Warren Prescott through every open-source database she knew, which was not a skill set listed on her Harlow General HR file, but was thoroughly documented on the service record she'd spent 3 years making sure no one around her associated with her face. What she found in 40 minutes of searching confirmed what Voss had said and added texture to it. Shell companies, consulting firm registrations. A pattern of activity that looked like legitimate private intelligence work until you mapped the clients against the outcomes and noticed that the outcomes consistently benefited people with reasons to want federal witnesses inaccessible. 6 years. Dozens of cases, potentially. One man with a firm built to locate, identify, and in at least one instance, today, eliminate people the federal justice system was trying to protect. And now, potentially, her name. Her real name. Both of them. She closed the laptop. She sat in her kitchen in the quiet of early evening and thought about what it meant to have spent 3 years building something careful and deliberate and have it become visible in a single morning. She thought about the man in Bay 1 who could hear her voice when he couldn't hear her words. She thought about Aldous in the doorway, saying his brother had 2 kids in Portland. She thought about the woman in room 318 with the cracked rib and the monitor cable and the specific kind of courage that didn't announce itself. She thought about the teenage boy in Bay 4 who had said, "They look kind of intense for a hospital," and had waved at her on his way out. She was still thinking when her phone rang. Not the number she'd called this morning. A different number. One she didn't recognize. She looked at it for 3 rings. On the 4th, she answered. Silence on the line. Then breathing. Then a voice she had never heard before, male, with a measured quality that was not the naturalness of calm, but the practice of it. "Ms. Stanton," the voice said, "or do you prefer Delacroix? I understand both names have their uses." She said nothing. "My name is Warren Prescott," the voice said. "I think we should have a conversation before things become unnecessarily complicated." The apartment was quiet around her. The plants on the windowsill caught the last of the evening light. "I'm listening," she said. "I know you are," Prescott said. "That's always been your best quality. You listen to things other people walk past." A pause. "The federal agents who are in your hospital today are very good at their jobs, but they're going to spend the next 12 to 18 hours processing what happened there. And in that time, the question of where I am becomes somewhat irrelevant, because I'm not the problem you need to solve right now." "What is?" she asked. "The copy of your file that my operative transmitted this morning," Prescott said. "Agent Voss told you it was intercepted, and she was correct. Her team intercepted the primary transmission." Another pause. "She didn't tell you about the secondary." Mara went very still. "There was a redundancy protocol," Prescott said. "A second automatic transmission triggered by the same action, routed through a different relay. 47 minutes before your team secured the device." His voice remained level, patient, the voice of a man who was used to delivering information at his own pace. "The secondary copy of your file, both names, current address, employment history, the full documentation, reached its destination before anyone in that building knew there was a second relay." She heard him. She believed him. Not because she trusted him, but because a man who had run this kind of operation for 6 years would absolutely build a redundancy protocol, and the absence of one would have been the thing that surprised her. "What do you want?" she asked. "Right now? Nothing," he said. "I want you to understand the situation accurately, which I think you prefer to comfortable inaccuracies." A breath. "The file is with someone who doesn't yet know what to do with it. That won't last. I have a certain amount of influence over what they do with it, and that influence has a shelf life." "You're offering a trade." "I'm offering a conversation," he said, "one that Agent Voss doesn't need to be part of. Not because I'm afraid of Agent Voss, because some conversations are more useful without an audience." The light was going off the windowsill now. The plants were in shadow. "Where?" she asked. He gave her an address, a coffee shop 3 miles from the hospital that she recognized as a real place. She'd passed it on her commute, had never been inside. "Tomorrow morning," he said, 7 a.m. "I'll be there," she said. She hung up. She sat in her kitchen for a long time. Then she picked up the phone again. Not to call Voss, not yet. And she opened a text to the number she'd called that morning. The number that had answered on the second ring with a voice that recognized hers. She typed, "He made contact, has secondary copy of file, wants meeting tomorrow 0700. She sent the address. "I'm going." The response came back in 90 seconds. "Don't." She typed back, "I know. Then she set the phone down on the table and looked at the address Prescott had given her and thought about a man who had spent 6 years building an operation sophisticated enough to place an agent inside a federal witness's hospital room, sophisticated enough to run a redundancy protocol on a data transmission, sophisticated enough to find her personal number within hours of learning her name, and who had still chosen to call her directly instead of simply using the file, which meant he wanted something from her that the file alone couldn't give him, which meant she had leverage she hadn't known about until 30 seconds ago, which meant tomorrow morning's meeting was not the threat he wanted her to believe it was. It was something else entirely, and she needed to know exactly what that was before she walked through that door. She didn't sleep much, not because she was afraid, though she understood that fear would have been a reasonable response to her situation. She didn't sleep because she was working, which was what she did with the hours between midnight and 4, when her mind decided that rest was a lower priority than preparation. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and a legal pad, and she mapped everything she knew about Warren Prescott's operation, not in the way she'd searched his name earlier, looking for what existed, but in the way she'd been trained to think about an adversary, looking for what was missing. 6 years of operation, sophisticated redundancy protocols, multiple shell companies, multiple operational arms, a contact network that had reached into a federal hospital security arrangement, an HR department, a chief administrator's office, and a charge nurse who had spent 11 years building a reputation for steadiness before 4 months of decisions that couldn't be undone. What didn't fit was the call. Prescott was not a man who made direct calls to people who'd disrupted his operations. The architecture of everything he'd built was about distance, shell companies and intermediaries and layers of authorized access that kept his name off every document and his voice out of every room. The entire infrastructure of Garrison Tactical Solutions was a machine designed to ensure that Warren Prescott was never the person holding anything, and he had called her from a number she now had. She wrote that down. Underneath it, she wrote, "He needs something only I can provide, not the file. The file is leverage, not the goal." She looked at that for a while. Then she called Voss. It was 1:47 a.m. Voss answered on the second ring, which told her either the agent had been expecting the call or she was also not sleeping. "He called you," Voss said. Not a question. "He knew about the secondary transmission before I did. He's been monitoring your team's communication." A pause. "We swept for, not a device. He has someone." Mara kept her voice level. "Someone with access to the federal response communication, at least at the level of operational status updates. He knew within the hour that your team had intercepted the primary transmission. He knew before you told me." A longer pause. "The secondary transmission," Voss said. "Did he confirm it reached a destination?" "He confirmed it. He also said the recipient doesn't yet know what to do with it, and that his influence over that recipient has a shelf life." "He's using it as a clock," Voss said. "Pressure without immediate action." "He wants a meeting, 7 a.m., a coffee shop 3 miles from the hospital." She gave the address. "He called it a conversation, without an audience." "You're not going." "I already told him I would." The silence on the line had a specific quality. Not anger, not surprise, more like the recalibration of someone adjusting a plan to account for a variable that had decided to make its own decisions. "What do you think he wants?" Voss asked. "Not me specifically, and not the leverage. If he wanted to use the file to simply expose me, he'd have done it without the call. He wants something he can only get through a direct negotiation with someone he believes will negotiate in good faith." "What would that be?" "The protected patient," Mara said. "Not physically. Information. His location post-testimony, his new identity, his recovery timeline. Prescott's operation failed to get the file from the system and failed to stop the patient before testimony. The testimony will happen. But whoever Prescott's clients are, the people who hired him to protect them from that testimony, they'll want to know what comes after, where the witness goes when the trial is done. And he thinks you know that." "I was in room 318. I spoke to the patient. I spoke to his companion. Prescott knows my background. He has my full file. He knows I have the kind of relationships with federal personnel that might include information sharing that doesn't go through official channels." She paused. "He's wrong. I don't know anything about where that patient goes next, but he doesn't know I don't know. So he's going to offer you a trade," Voss said. "Secondary file destroyed, your identity protected, in exchange for information you don't have." And I'm going to let him make the offer, Mara said, on a recorded line, in a location your team can cover, with enough specificity in his language that the offer itself constitutes an attempt to obstruct a federal witness protection arrangement. The pause this time was different. You've done this before, Voss said. I've been in situations where the right move was to let someone talk until they said the wrong thing, Mara said, which is different from doing it before. Barely. Barely, she agreed. They worked through the logistics for 40 minutes. Voss had a technical specialist who could wire Mara in a way that wouldn't register on a standard sweep. Prescott would likely have someone do a physical check, she said. He was too careful not to. And the coffee shop's layout allowed for two-person coverage from adjacent positions without obvious federal agent visibility, which was a challenge in a 3-mile radius of a hospital that currently had federal vehicles in its parking structure and had likely been noted by anyone monitoring the situation. At 2:47 a.m., Voss said, "If he makes you at any point, if the meeting goes wrong, you leave." "I know. I'm serious, Mara. Whatever's in that file, whatever the secondary transmission means for your current identity, it's manageable. There are processes. It's not worth—" "I know," Mara said again, gently. "I'll leave if it goes wrong." She was not interested in being a martyr for a situation she'd stumbled into by going to work on a Tuesday. But she was also clear that the meeting wasn't going to go wrong because Prescott needed her to be there willingly and compliant, and that needed her to still be someone he thought he could manage. And she had spent 20 minutes analyzing exactly what kind of person he'd concluded she was based on her file. And she understood the version of her he was expecting to walk through that door. She was going to let him believe she was that person for exactly as long as she needed to. The coffee shop was called Mercer's, and it had been in that location for 16 years according to the small brass plaque by the door. And it was the kind of place that had regulars who came every day and sat in the same seats and were known by their orders rather than their names. At 7 in the morning, it smelled like dark roast and something baked with cardamom, and there were 7 other customers when Mara walked in, 3 of whom she clocked as Voss's people within 4 seconds of entry. Prescott was already there. He was at a corner table. Of course he was. Corner tables allowed observation of both entry points, standard positioning, with a coffee he'd probably ordered the moment he arrived, and had been nursing while he watched the door. He was in his mid-50s, gray-haired, dressed in the business casual uniform of a man who wanted to read as a consultant or a lawyer rather than whatever he actually was. He had the build of someone who had once been physically capable and had moved to a life that didn't require it, and the eyes of someone who was still doing the work his body no longer did. He looked at her when she came in. She went to the counter, ordered coffee, paid for it with cash, and took it to his table. She sat down across from him without being invited and without saying anything, which she did because it established immediately that she was not the version of herself he'd expected, not anxious, not cooperative, not performing the reasonable person effect of someone hoping he'd be gracious. He studied her for a moment. "You look rested," he said. "I slept fine," she said, which was a lie, and they both knew it, and it didn't matter. "I appreciate you coming." "You had leverage," she said. "I came to understand it. That's refreshingly direct." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "The secondary transmission is real. Your file, both identity layers, current address, employment record, the background check documentation that your contact provided when you took the position at Harlow General, is in the possession of an individual who works for the people I contract with. As of this morning, they haven't acted on it. That will change in approximately," he glanced at his watch, "36 hours, at which point my ability to intervene in what they do with it becomes significantly more complicated." "Why would you intervene at all?" she asked. "Because intervention is worth something to me," he said, "and I'd rather convert it to something useful than let it expire." "What do you want?" "The patient in room 3-18, specifically his post-testimony protective arrangement. Location category, region, not street address. New identity structure, whether it's a full change or a modified documentation. Recovery timeline, how long he'll be in medical care under federal supervision." He said it evenly, without apology. "That information delivered to me and the secondary file is destroyed. Your current identity stays intact. Your past stays buried. You go back to your life." She looked at him. He looked back. "That's a lot to offer for information I may not have," she said. "I believe you have access to it." "Why?" Because the federal response team that entered Harlow General yesterday included personnel with a specific operational relationship to witness security logistics. The woman leading that team spoke to you privately, multiple times, in settings that suggested more than a standard witness response briefing. He tilted his head slightly. You're not just a nurse who happened to notice our credentials were wrong. You have a history with these systems. I've read your file. I know what you were before Harlow General. Then you know I was a medic, she said. Not an intelligence officer, not a WITSEC coordinator. I know what your official record says. It says what it says because that's what it was. He smiled slightly. The woman you spent 3 years becoming is very convincing. She's not a performance, Mara said. She's who I am. He considered that. Took a sip of coffee. Looked out the window for a moment at the ordinary morning on an ordinary street, people with dogs, a delivery truck idling, a woman pushing a stroller past the window with the distracted focus of someone composing a text while navigating a sidewalk. Will you help me? He asked. Just like that. Not threatening, asking. And that was the moment she'd been waiting for, because he'd shifted from leverage to request, and that shift was everything, and she needed him to stay in that register for approximately 90 more seconds. Tell me something first, she said. The patient in that room. If you'd gotten the information you needed yesterday, his location, his new identity, what would have happened to him? Prescott looked at her steadily. That's not a question I'm in a position to answer. You just answered it, she said. He was quiet. The people who hired you, she said, they needed him not to testify, or failing that, not to be able to testify to anything that could be verified afterward. That's what the jammer was for. 90 seconds of flatlined monitoring on a man whose 6 days post-cardiac surgery looks like a complication, natural, tragic, not criminal. She set her coffee down. You built an operation around killing a man who was in a hospital bed recovering from open-heart surgery. I built an operation around retrieving information, he said. What my clients intended, you knew what they intended, she said. You've been doing this for 6 years. You know exactly what your clients intend. The information is the mechanism, not the goal, and you're smart enough to understand the difference, and you've chosen not to. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt. She didn't think he had easy access to guilt anymore, but something that had been guilt once and had been rationalized into something more manageable and less useful. The file, he said. His voice was slightly different now, still controlled, but the control was doing more work than it had been. You should care about the file. I do, she said, but not as much as you need me to. She stood up. Sit down, he said. No. She picked up her coffee. You called me because you needed something that required my willing participation. If you just had the file sent to whoever your clients want to send it to, you'd have done it without the call. You need me compliant. You need me scared enough to give you something, so that you have something to deliver to the people who hired you, because your operation failed and you need to recover their confidence, and you can't do that with a file alone. She looked at him. I don't know anything about where that patient goes next. I spoke to him for 4 minutes about his heart rate. I don't have what you need, and even if I did, she stopped. Because at the table near the window, one of the 3 people she'd clocked as Voss's team had stood up, and so had the other 2. And the door to Mercer's coffee shop opened, and Voss walked in with 2 additional personnel, and the specific quality of the room changed in the way rooms changed when the people with authority in them shifted from one group to another. Prescott looked at the door, looked at Mara. You came wired, he said. I came prepared, she said. Which is different. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. Not much. A short, dry exhalation that acknowledged the situation with more self-awareness than she'd given him credit for. Your file said you were good, he said. It undersold you. Most files do, she said. Voss arrived at the table. Warren Prescott, you're under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice, attempted witness tampering, and solicitation of protected federal information. She looked at Mara once, just once, a look that carried acknowledgement without theatrics, and then focused entirely on Prescott and the business of placing him in handcuffs in a coffee shop on an ordinary Wednesday morning, while the other customers watched with the fascinated wariness of people who had stumbled into something they'd be describing for years. Prescott didn't resist. He stood when asked, moved when directed, and maintained the composure of a man who had anticipated this possibility and had decided, somewhere before the morning, that his remaining leverage was silence and the performance of dignity. He looked at Mara once more before they walked him out. "The secondary file," he said. "The contact holding it." "Agent Voss has the name," Mara said, "from your phone. The one you called me from last night." She paused. "You should have used a different number." He looked at her, then looked away. They walked him out into the morning. But the secondary file was secured by 11 a.m. The contact, a man named Duval, who had worked as a data broker for Prescott's network for 4 years, was taken into custody at a location in the city 47 minutes after Prescott's arrest, with the file still undelivered to any of Prescott's clients. He had been waiting, as Prescott had said, for instructions on what to do with it, and the instruction that arrived instead of Prescott's guidance was a federal arrest warrant. Mara was at the hospital when she heard. She was not officially on shift. She had come in because she couldn't not come in, because the Bay 1 patient's ICU transfer notes needed a clinical follow-up from someone familiar with his morning presentation, and because the post-surgical ward's charge nurse situation was unsettled after the previous day's events, and because hospitals the morning after a federal operation are disorienting places that needed people who knew their way around. Voss found her in the break room at 11:15. "Duval's in custody," she said. "The file is secured. Our technical team has confirmed there were no further transmissions." She sat down across from Mara without being invited, which Mara noted as a change from yesterday. "It's done." "Prescott's clients," Mara said. "The people who hired him." 2 arrests in the last hour. They're named in Hargrove's records and in communications on Prescott's phone. Federal prosecutors are calling it a significant day. She said that last part with the dry understatement of someone who didn't deal in significant days lightly. "The protected patient. Testimony is scheduled. The timeline is unchanged. He'll be moved to a secure location for recovery after." Voss paused. "His companion, for what it's worth, has a cracked rib confirmed by imaging and refused anything stronger than ibuprofen." "That sounds right," Mara said. "She asked about you. The companion. She wanted to know your name." Voss looked at her. "I told her Mara Stanton. She said to tell you." She checked her phone, reading something she'd apparently written down. She said, "Tell her the monitor cable trick works better than it has any right to." Mara sat with that for a moment. "She improvised," she said. "She did," Voss agreed. "Under considerable stress, with a cracked rib." "People surprise you," Mara said. "Some of them," Voss said. "Not all of them." She looked at Mara with the directness that had been present since the corridor the previous morning, the quality of someone who didn't perform connections they didn't mean. "You could have called us when you identified the credentials. You could have stepped back and let the process work." "The process wasn't working fast enough for the people in the building," Mara said. "No, it wasn't." Voss was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, and I understand it might not be worth much given that we were the ones in the building when things went wrong, your read on everything was accurate. The credentials, the rotation pattern, the access point, Deborah Finch, the redundancy protocol, all of it." She paused. "That's not a skill set that comes from nursing alone." "It came from both," Mara said. "That's the thing people miss. The nursing isn't a cover. It's not a costume I put on when I left the service. I went into trauma medicine because I'd spent 3 years watching people come back from the field with injuries that had been badly managed in the initial window, and I wanted to know how to do that part right." She looked at the table. "The two things are the same skill. Assess the room, identify the threat, keep the patient alive. The room changes, the skill doesn't." Voss nodded slowly. "Hargrove," Mara said. "Deborah. What happens to them?" "Hargrove is cooperating fully. His cooperation will factor into sentencing, but he's looking at federal charges for his role in the access authorization, the credential sharing, and his decision not to report the operation once he understood its nature. His attorneys are negotiating the shape of it." Voss paused. "Deborah Finch made a statement last night that was detailed enough to implicate Prescott's network in 3 additional cases we didn't have documented. Her attorney is working with prosecutors. Her cooperation is substantial. Will it matter? It'll matter to how the case is built. Whether it matters to her outcome, that's for someone else to decide." Mara thought about Deborah standing at the loading dock door with the particular fatigue of someone at the end of a road they couldn't see the beginning of anymore. She thought about 11 years and 4 months and the specific way that people made decisions that compounded until the decision maker didn't recognize themselves anymore. She didn't think Deborah was a bad person. She thought Deborah was a person who had made a bad decision and then been given reasons not to unmake it until it was too late to unmake it. She also thought about the patient in 318 who could have died in 90 seconds of manipulated silence, and she held both of those things in the same space without resolving them into something tidier than they were. 3 days after, the interim hospital director, a woman named Calloway who had been brought in from the regional health authority, and who had the focused practicality of someone dropped into a situation she hadn't caused and was determined to improve, called a meeting of the department leads and senior clinical staff. Mara was not a department lead or senior clinical staff by title. She was a trauma unit nurse, charge nurse level experience, no administrative designation. She was invited anyway. The meeting was in the main conference room, and it covered 2 hours of ground that needed covering: the security audit findings, the administrative restructuring, the staff support resources being made available, and the formal review of the suspension actions taken under Hargrove's tenure, all of which were being vacated. When Calloway got to the security audit section, she pulled up a summary of the incident timeline, what had been identified, when, and by whom, and walked through it with the directness of someone who believed in naming things accurately. At 5:47 a.m. on Tuesday, she said, a member of our nursing staff identified irregularities in the credentials of the personnel who entered through the emergency service entrance. She flagged those irregularities to supervision, to administration, and directly to the personnel in question. She was dismissed, redirected, and ultimately suspended by an administrator who had a personal interest in the irregularities not being investigated. She paused. She remained in the building, continued providing patient care, and ultimately played a central role in the federal response that resulted in the arrest of 8 individuals and the protection of a federal witness. She looked up from the summary. Mara Stanton. People turned to look at her. She did not particularly want to be looked at. She was sitting near the middle of the table, and she didn't straighten or nod or perform the acknowledgement that seemed to be expected because she'd never been comfortable with the theater of recognition, and she saw no reason to start. We're restoring her position, Calloway continued, with a formal notation in her employment record that the suspension was administratively improper and is being expunged. Additionally, the hospital is initiating a formal commendation for her actions during this incident, which will be documented and submitted to the state nursing board. Someone started clapping. It spread around the table in the way applause spreads in rooms where people need somewhere to put the tension that's been sitting in them for 3 days. Mara looked at her hands on the table. She thought about the 5:15 quiet of the trauma bay on an ordinary morning, the slightly burnt coffee from the nurse's station pot, the way the monitors sounded when a room was stable, a steady rhythmic confirmation that someone on the other side of the equipment was still alive. She thought about a man who had heard her voice through a resuscitation and couldn't make out the words, but knew someone was there. She thought about this, the things she'd been good at, in a uniform, in a forward operating base medical unit with the particular chaos of a combat environment. The thing was not combat. The thing was the same thing she'd been good at for 3 years in this building. She showed up. She paid attention. When something was wrong, she said so. When someone needed her to stay, she stayed, even when staying was inconvenient, even when the people in authority would have preferred she left. That wasn't military training, that wasn't nursing training. That was the thing you had before training gave it a name. The applause settled. Calloway moved to the next item on the agenda. She went back to the trauma bay, not that afternoon. That afternoon she went home and slept for 9 hours without difficulty, and woke up to the particular ordinary morning light of a life that had not in the end been dismantled by a Tuesday. But the next morning, at 5:15, because that was when she came in, and she saw no reason to change it. The coffee was slightly burnt. Bay 1 was empty. The patient transferred to a step-down unit in good condition. Bay 2 had a new patient, a woman in her 70s with a hip fracture and the fierce, clear-eyed pragmatism of someone who has decided that a broken hip is an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. Bay 3 was empty. Bay 4 had a young man, early 20s, construction injury, who was awake when Mara came in to check his chart and said, "Is it always this busy here?" "Mostly," she said. "The nurse last night said there was some kind of federal thing happening a couple days ago." There was. What happened? She looked at his chart, adjusted the IV flow rate marginally. Someone needed help and got it, she said. He thought about that, nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've decided an incomplete answer is probably enough. She went back to the nursing station. Petra was there, working through the morning admissions documentation with the slightly less startled quality of someone whose worldview had been reorganized by the week's events into something more resilient. She looked up when Mara came in. Dr. Ferris wants to know if you're taking the trauma lead rotation starting next month, Petra said. She should ask me herself. She said she's asking through channels because you intimidate her. She's a 22-year trauma surgeon. She said that's why you intimidate her. Mara thought about it. The trauma lead rotation was a senior clinical role. More responsibility, more administrative involvement, more hours that weren't technically hours, more of the work that happened in the space between shifts rather than during them. It was the kind of role she'd told herself she wasn't interested in 3 years ago, when she came to Harlow General quiet and careful and intent on taking up as little space as possible. Tell her yes, Mara said. Petra wrote it down. At 6:15, Aldous texted her from a number she didn't have in her phone yet. The text said, "My brother wants to call you, if that's okay." And then, after a pause, "He wants to say thank you. He's been wanting to for a while. He just didn't know where to find you." She looked at that for a moment. She typed back, "Give him the number." She put the phone in her pocket and walked the length of the trauma corridor doing her check. Bay 1, empty. Bay 2, the woman with the hip fracture, stable, awake already, asking the overnight nurse when she could get up. Bay 3, empty. Bay 4, the young man dozing now, vitals steady. The corridor was quiet in the particular way of 5:15 on a morning that had not decided yet what it was going to be. She had a cracked rib's worth of evidence that ordinary people, when put in extraordinary situations, were capable of more than they'd been told. She had a man in Portland with 2 kids who existed because someone had made a decision in 6 minutes without enough information and managed anyway. She had the memory of a voice she'd heard once through a phone saying, "Give me 6 hours," and meaning it, and a woman at a loading dock door who had looked at her and said, "I knew," with an honesty that cost something. She had a building full of people who had spent a week being afraid and were coming back to work anyway, which was not a small thing. Most things that looked like courage were just that, showing up on the other side of the fear. Not because the fear was gone, but because what was on the other side mattered more. She stood at the end of the corridor with her coffee, in the quiet, and thought about the version of herself who had come to this city 3 years ago, planning to disappear into the ordinary structure of a working life. Thinking that ordinary was something she could sustain if she just wanted it enough, if she just made herself small enough, if she just kept her head down and did her job and didn't look too hard at things that seemed wrong. She hadn't managed any of that. She'd looked. She'd spoken up. She'd stayed when she was told to go. Not because she was brave in the cinematic sense of the word, but because she was built in a way that made it genuinely difficult to walk past a thing she recognized as dangerous. And she had spent 3 years trying to override that, and it had overridden her instead. Maybe that was the thing worth keeping, not the background, not the call sign, not the record that said she'd pulled 4 men from a structure in a combat zone with 6 minutes and no air support. Those things were hers, but they weren't her. What was hers was simpler and older than any of it. She paid attention. She didn't look away. She stayed. The woman who had walked into this building 3 years ago trying to be invisible had turned out to be someone who couldn't do it, not because she'd failed, but because she'd misunderstood what she was trying to do. You didn't become invisible by hiding what you were. You became invisible by letting the people around you decide what you were and not correcting them, and she had done that, and it had worked. And then a Tuesday morning had arrived, and she'd looked at a patch with the wrong thread color, and she'd said exactly what she saw. She wasn't going to try to be invisible anymore. She was going to be here, in this building, in this corridor, in this work, the way she actually was. The version who saw things, who spoke up, who stayed. The version that people had been trying to dismiss and route around and suspend and intimidate for 36 hours and had found, each time, still present, still standing, still looking. The first ambulance of the morning rolled into the bay. She set down her coffee, pulled on her gloves, and walked toward it. Some people spend their whole lives making themselves smaller so the world around them stays comfortable. They swallow what they see. They reroute around the thing that needs to be said. They learn to read the room, And then they do what the room wants, even when the room is wrong. Mara Stanton had tried that. It hadn't taken. And the people in that ambulance, whoever they were, whatever they'd survived to get here, were going to be taken care of by someone who had stopped pretending she was anything less than what she was. That had to be enough. It was.